The morning of June 22, 1941, began unlike any other day in the Soviet Union. As the sun rose over Soviet territory, the earth shook with the deafening sound of artillery bombardment and the roar of aircraft engines. Thousands of German bombers filled the skies above Soviet lands. German tanks and motorized troops came pouring across the border in a massive military invasion that would become the largest campaign of destruction in human history. The German Wehrmacht attacked along a front stretching over 1,000 miles from the Baltic Sea in the north to the Black Sea in the south. This was Operation Barbarossa, the German invasion of the Soviet Union. Hitler had broken his word. The non-aggression pact that had been signed in 1939 was now torn to shreds and rendered meaningless. The German dictator had lied to Stalin. The invasion caught the Soviet Union unprepared. Stalin had believed that Hitler would not attack while still fighting Britain in the West. This terrible mistake left the Red Army vulnerable and scattered across the vast Soviet landscape. German forces advanced with terrifying speed, crushing everything in their path. Soviet commanders were confused and uncertain. Some did not believe the warnings they had received about the German attack. But even as German armies poured into Soviet territory, the Soviet state would begin to mobilize its enormous resources for total war. When the shocking news of the invasion reached Stalin, he fell into a state of profound shock and confusion. The Soviet leader could not immediately accept what was happening. For 11 long days after the invasion began, Stalin remained largely silent. He gave no speeches, issued no declarations, and provided no guidance to the Soviet people. The radio went silent. The newspapers had no direction from the Kremlin. Many Soviet citizens wondered where their leader had gone. They questioned whether Stalin had abandoned the Soviet people in their darkest hour. Some feared that the Soviet state was collapsing under the weight of the German attack. But Stalin was not inactive during this silence. He was meeting with his military commanders and advisors. He was attempting to understand the full scope and meaning of the invasion. He was trying to grasp how thoroughly Hitler had deceived him. Stalin had believed in the treaty between Germany and the Soviet Union. He had thought that Hitler would respect the agreement that had been made. Now he had to confront the reality that Hitler was a liar and that Germany was committed to the complete destruction of the Soviet state. Stalin was also reorganizing the government and preparing for the long struggle ahead. On July 3, 1941, Stalin finally broke his silence with a historic radio broadcast. Stalin addressed the Soviet people on July 3, 1941 with words that were unprecedented for him. For the first time in his life as a Soviet leader, he addressed his countrymen as brothers and sisters and as his friends. This was shocking to Soviet citizens who had only known Stalin to speak with cold authority and stern command. But this moment was different. The Soviet Union faced an existential threat from Nazi Germany. German armies were advancing rapidly into Soviet territory, conquering cities and destroying entire regions. The German invasion plan was to reach Moscow and the Urals and completely destroy the Soviet Union within a matter of weeks. Stalin understood that he could not speak as a distant dictator at this moment. He had to speak as a man addressing his fellow countrymen in the face of terrible danger. He had to inspire the people to resist the invasion with every fiber of their being. He had to create a sense of unity and common purpose that would carry the Soviet people through the terrible ordeal that lay ahead. The situation was desperate and demanded that Stalin speak differently than he ever had before. His words on July 3 would become legendary in Soviet history and would be remembered throughout the war. Stalin began his radio address by explaining the non-aggression pact that the Soviet Union had signed with Germany in 1939. He defended the decision to sign this treaty, saying that no peace-loving nation could refuse a peaceful arrangement with a neighboring country, even if that country was led by monsters like Hitler and Ribbentrop. Stalin argued that the Soviet Union had used the time granted by the pact to prepare its defenses and mobilize its military forces. But despite all the warnings and intelligence reports that had predicted an invasion, Hitler had chosen to betray the pact. The German dictator had launched a treacherous attack against the Soviet Union. This was not a formal declaration of war made in advance. Instead, it was a stab in the back against a nation that had honored its commitment to peace. Stalin wanted the Soviet people to understand that this war was not the result of Soviet aggression or ambition. The Soviet Union had not wanted war. Stalin had pursued a policy of avoiding conflict with Germany, but Hitler had forced this war upon the Soviet people and had left them no choice but to fight. Stalin then addressed the rapid retreat of Soviet forces in the face of the German invasion. German armies had captured Lithuania, Latvia, parts of Byelorussia, and portions of Ukraine. German bombers were striking cities deep within Soviet territory. Leningrad and Moscow itself were now threatened by German forces. Stalin acknowledged that some Soviet commanders had begun to question whether the German fascists were truly invincible as Nazi propaganda proclaimed. But Stalin rejected this idea completely. He declared that the German army was not invincible and could be defeated. The rapid German advances were not due to German military superiority, but rather to the fact that the Red Army had been caught completely unprepared by the suddenness and violence of the German attack. German forces had struck with complete surprise and overwhelming force. The initial assaults had been so powerful and so sudden that Soviet forces had been unable to mount an effective defense, but Stalin insisted that this situation would change. The Red Army would recover from the initial shock of the invasion. Soviet forces would stand firm against the Nazi invaders. Stalin explained that Germany had hoped to create an international coalition against the Soviet Union. The German High Command had believed that they could frighten the Western powers into joining an alliance against communism. Germany had calculated that Britain and the United States would view Soviet communism as a greater threat than Nazi tyranny. If this coalition could be formed, Germany believed the Soviet Union would be isolated and easily defeated. But Stalin pointed out that this plan had completely failed. Britain had not joined any coalition with Germany against the Soviet Union. Instead, Britain was now offering support to the Soviet Union in the fight against Nazi tyranny. Even the United States, though not yet at war with Germany, had indicated a willingness to provide material assistance and supplies to the Soviet Union. Stalin highlighted that a new alliance was forming between the Soviet Union, Britain, and eventually the United States. This alliance of free peoples would grow stronger as the war continued. The anti-Nazi coalition would ultimately prove stronger than the Axis powers combined. Stalin then called upon the working people of Moscow and Leningrad to form people's militia units to support the Red Army. He demanded that such people's militia groups be raised in every city that was threatened by German invasion. All working people had to be roused to defend their freedom, their honor, and their country in what Stalin called the Patriotic War against German fascism. Stalin wanted to transform the entire Soviet society into a nation mobilized for war. Every factory, every workplace, every village had to be organized for military purposes. Workers had to increase production of military equipment, weapons, ammunition, and supplies. Farmers had to ensure food production for the armed forces and the population. Stalin understood that winning this war would require the mobilization of all Soviet resources and the participation of every Soviet citizen. This was not a war that could be fought by the military alone. The entire Soviet state had to become a weapon against the German invaders. Stalin ordered the formation of a state committee of defense that would coordinate all aspects of the war effort and concentrate all state power in its hands. Stalin emphasized that the nature of this conflict was fundamentally different from ordinary wars between nations competing for power and territory. This was a struggle between completely different systems and ways of life. On one side stood the Soviet Union and its system of socialism and working people. On the other side stood Nazi Germany and its system of fascism and oppression. Stalin declared that the Germans wanted to seize Soviet lands watered by the sweat of Soviet workers and to steal Soviet grain and oil secured by Soviet labor. The Germans wanted to restore the rule of landlords and aristocrats and to turn the Soviet people into slaves. Hitler wanted to destroy Soviet national culture and the national existence of all peoples in the Soviet Union. The Germans wanted to Germanize the peoples of the Soviet territory and impose German rule over them forever. Stalin made clear that this was not a war about border disputes or territorial claims. This was a war about whether the Soviet people would remain free or fall into slavery under Nazi rule. There could be no middle ground. There could be no compromise with Nazism. One side had to be completely defeated and destroyed. Stalin called upon the Soviet people to understand that this war was one of life or death for the entire Soviet nation. Either the peoples of the Soviet Union would remain free and independent, or they would fall into slavery and bondage under Nazi rule. There could be no negotiation, no peace treaty, no compromise with Hitler. This was total war in its truest and most brutal sense. Every Soviet citizen had to abandon all thoughts of normal peaceful life. Work had to be reorganized for military purposes. All resources had to be devoted to defeating the German invaders. Every factory worker had to produce weapons and military equipment. Every farmer had to grow food for the armed forces. Every youth had to prepare themselves for military service. Every citizen had to contribute to the war effort in whatever way they could. Stalin was demanding nothing less than the total mobilization of Soviet society for war. He was asking for sacrifice from every Soviet person. He was asking for willingness to die for the defense of the Soviet state and the freedom of the Soviet people. Stalin demanded that there be no room in Soviet society for cowardice or surrender. He declared that panic-mongers and deserters would not be tolerated. Soviet soldiers had to display the courage and bravery that had always been the tradition of the Soviet people. Stalin invoked the memory of Lenin, the founder of the Soviet state, and his emphasis on fearlessness and heroism in struggle against enemies. Stalin declared that these qualities had to become the qualities of millions and millions of Soviet citizens. Every Red Army soldier had to be ready to fight and die for his country. Every Soviet citizen had to be prepared to resist Nazi occupation with their last breath and their last drop of blood. Stalin's words were harsh and demanding. He offered no mercy for those who betrayed the cause. He offered no hope for compromise with the enemy. This was a fight to the death between two irreconcilable systems. One side had to survive, and the other had to be destroyed. Stalin gave explicit orders about how Soviet territory should be handled if German forces forced Soviet armies to retreat, if Soviet military units had to withdraw from captured areas, All locomotives and railway cars had to be evacuated to prevent the Germans from using them. All grain supplies had to be confiscated by state authorities and transported to the rear. Collective farmers had to drive off their cattle and livestock to prevent the Germans from capturing Soviet food supplies. Any valuable industrial equipment that could not be moved had to be destroyed rather than captured. Stalin was ordering a complete scorched earth policy. If Soviet territory had to be given to the Germans, the Soviets would leave nothing of value behind for the occupiers to use. Everything had to be burned, destroyed, or removed. This was total war in the truest sense, with no considerations for the welfare of civilians or the preservation of property. This was war for national survival in which no sacrifice was too great. Stalin ordered the formation of partisan guerrilla units in all areas that were threatened by German invasion or occupation. These resistance fighters were to conduct sabotage operations against German troops and military installations. They were to blow up bridges and roads to prevent German movement. They were to destroy telephone and telegraph lines to disrupt German communications. They were to attack German supply lines and convoys to starve the German armies of ammunition and food. Stalin wanted to create an entire army of resistance fighters behind German lines who would make the German occupation of Soviet territory as costly and difficult as possible. These partisan units would prevent the Germans from consolidating their control over conquered Soviet regions. They would tie down hundreds of thousands of German soldiers who had to be deployed to fight guerrillas instead of being used on the front lines against the Red Army. The partisan war would become a crucial part of the Soviet strategy to defeat Nazi Germany. In November 1941, Stalin addressed soldiers on Red Square during the celebration of the 24th anniversary of the October Revolution. Stalin told the soldiers that the German invaders were cruel and showed no mercy to anyone, murdering women and children and the elderly. But Stalin assured the soldiers and the Soviet people that Germany could be defeated. He declared that the outcome of the war was not in doubt. The rapid German advance that had characterized the early months of the war had already begun to slow down. The German plan for a quick victory through lightning war had failed. German forces had not reached Moscow. German armies were bogged down in brutal fighting. Soviet reserves were only now being fully mobilized and deployed to the front. Stalin said that Germany had lost more than 4.5 million soldiers in the first 4.5 months of war, while Germany faced chronic shortages of food and supplies and was bleeding white. Stalin's confidence that Soviet forces would ultimately prevail was based on his understanding of the economic resources available to each side. Although Germany had conquered vast territories in the opening months of the war, it lacked the industrial capacity and economic resources to sustain a prolonged conflict. The Soviet Union, by contrast, possessed vast territories stretching to the Urals and beyond. The Soviet Union had enormous populations and access to raw materials that Germany could not capture. If the war could be prolonged, if Soviet forces could hold their ground and avoid total defeat, then eventually German strength would be exhausted. Stalin also understood that the Soviet Union was no longer fighting alone. Britain had allied with the Soviet Union against Nazi Germany. The United States, after the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, had also joined the anti-Nazi coalition. The industrial production and military resources of these allied powers would eventually tip the balance decisively in favor of the anti-Nazi coalition. With American factories producing weapons and supplies in enormous quantities, the Soviet Union would have the resources necessary to defeat Germany. Stalin's speeches and declarations during the early period of the German invasion established themes that would recur throughout the entire Second World War. He spoke of defending Soviet soil and Soviet independence against German conquest and destruction. He appealed to Russian nationalism and to the historical struggles of the Russian people against foreign invaders over many centuries. He depicted the war as a great patriotic struggle in which all Soviet citizens had to participate. He called it the Great Patriotic War, using language that created a sense of national unity against an external enemy. Stalin even permitted the revival of Russian Orthodox Christianity during the war, understanding that religious sentiment could help mobilize the population in support of the war effort. The Soviet leader transformed the conflict into a struggle for national survival and national independence rather than framing it primarily as a communist ideological struggle against fascism. Stalin's response to the German invasion demonstrated both his ruthlessness as a leader and his understanding of the psychological factors necessary to mobilize a nation for total war. He acknowledged the grave danger that threatened the Soviet Union. He acknowledged the sacrifices that would be required from the Soviet people. He offered no false optimism or easy assurances of quick victory. Instead, he called for total commitment and demanded absolute dedication to the war effort. He created a sense of purpose and meaning that extended beyond the survival of the Soviet state to the preservation of Russian civilization itself and the independence of all Soviet peoples. This framing of the war as a struggle for national and cultural survival proved to be highly effective in sustaining Soviet morale and determination through the terrible years of warfare that lay ahead. The invasion on June 22, 1941 was the beginning of what would become the most destructive and brutal war in human history. Millions of Soviet citizens and soldiers would die in the conflict. Soviet cities would be destroyed and reduced to rubble. the entire countryside would be devastated. German armies would eventually reach deep inside Soviet territory, coming close to Moscow and besieging Leningrad for nearly 3 years. But Stalin's determination to resist invasion and his mobilization of Soviet resources would ultimately prove decisive in determining the outcome of the war. The Red Army would recover from the shock of the initial invasion. Soviet forces would stand firm at critical battles like Stalingrad and Kursk. Eventually, Soviet armies would push the Germans back and carry the war into Germany itself. Stalin's speeches in July 1941 set the tone for Soviet resistance and determination that would persist for 4 long years of brutal warfare and terrible suffering. Stalin's response to the German invasion stands as a moment of historical significance, equal to other great moments of wartime leadership. Though different in tone and content from Churchill's eloquent warnings or his calls for universal human freedom, Stalin's speeches were effective in their purpose and impact. They motivated Soviet resistance and helped to forge a sense of national unity that carried the Soviet people through the war. Stalin understood the psychology of his people and appealed to their patriotism and sense of national pride and national survival. He created a framework of meaning that made enormous sacrifice and death in service to the state comprehensible and even noble. Whether through appeals to communist ideology or to traditional Russian nationalism and Russian history, Stalin succeeded in rallying the Soviet people to resist Nazi invasion and occupation. The result was a victory that came at an almost incomprehensible cost in human lives, but that ultimately preserved Soviet independence. The Great Patriotic War, as Stalin called it, would become the defining event of the 20th century and the Soviet experience. The war on the Eastern Front became the most decisive and brutal campaign of the Second World War. German military forces faced an opponent that could not be defeated through blitzkrieg tactics or rapid conquest. The Soviet Union had the population, resources, and determination to fight a long war of attrition. Stalin's mobilization of Soviet society created a war machine that could absorb enormous losses and continue fighting. The ultimate German defeat on the Eastern Front broke the back of the Nazi war machine and made German defeat inevitable. Though the victory came at a cost of tens of millions of Soviet lives, Stalin's leadership and the sacrifice of the Soviet people proved decisive in defeating Nazi tyranny. Stalin's words in July 1941 had proven prophetic. The German army was not invincible. The Soviet Union could and would defeat Hitler's Germany. The legacy of Stalin's response to the invasion would shape Soviet history in the course of the 20th century.